Thank you, all of you, for being here. Last session of the day. I'm going to start with a question, and then I'll get to the introductions. How many of you remember that wonderful, iconic photograph of ISRO scientists celebrating and congratulating themselves after the success of the Mars orbiter mission? Okay, I'm going to put... This is, of course, a wonderful photograph. These women in their magnificent Kanjivaram saris, pure joy. And a lot of foreign press picked it up. I think Reuters, BBC carried that picture. This all-women powerful team. The fact of the matter is that only 20% of ISRO's science staff is made up of women, is comprised of women. And of course, no woman has ever headed it. That's the reality. Angela Saini points out in Inferior that even Charles Darwin, the great father of evolution, subscribed to the notion that women, though generally superior to men in moral qualities, are inferior intellectually. Yet how much things have changed. You could say Darwin was a product of his time. Women didn't get the vote till 1882, I believe, right, in the UK. So how much things have actually changed or haven't can perhaps be seen in prevalent male attitudes to women in science. Fast forward to just a few months ago when an engineer at Google wrote a memo saying, hey, women can't do science. James Damore, of course, got sacked, and he has since emerged as somewhat of a hero in certain right-wing circles, and has, of course, sued Google for wrongful termination. Are women equipped to do science? A very basic question. Ladies and gentlemen, my panel here is living, breathing proof of that question, living, breathing proof of that answer. It's, quite obvious. Smithsonian calls her a star professor among stars. She is the first tenured female theoretical physicist at Harvard and one of the most cited and influential scientists of our times. I'm not saying woman scientist, I'm saying scientist of our times. She writes books with cool titles like Knocking on Heaven's Door and her latest Dinosaurs and Dark Matter. You will be hearing from her when she picks up the Nobel for Physics. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Lisa Randall. Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw set out to become a brewmaster and is one of the very few women scientist entrepreneurs who has, on her own steam, made it to the very top to establish and head a fully integrated biopharmaceutical company, and has just been appointed to the US-India Business Council Board. Congratulations and welcome. What a great audience. Thank you. Angela Saini is busy demolishing a lot of the old rules and ideas about women's place in science. Her latest book, Inferior, dissects the new research that's rewriting the story and has won the Physics World Book of the Year. She's already at work on her next book that looks at science and race. Thank you. So I'm going to ask Angela to talk about this book, Inferior. Are women inferior?
What can I say? The title is ironic, so nobody take this literally, please, although there are some people on Twitter who do. So the reason I wrote Inferior is because as women, we get fed such contradictory information about ourselves. Even in scientific journals, we're told that women are worse at parking, we're not as good at map reading, we don't have as much spatial awareness, that men aren't as good at using vocabulary, they don't have the language skills, the emotion, the intuition. And I really just wanted to know the truth. What actually does science tell us about sex difference, about gender? And as it turned out, the research itself, though interesting, and actually paints a very different picture from the stereotypes, in as much as psychological differences are very small, brain-wise, we really don't, there's hardly any difference there at all. What's interesting is why this research is done and what we read from this research. What are the motivations of the people who are doing it and the people who are funding the people who are doing it? And that's really what the book is about, looking at the story behind the science, if you like. And it was shocking to me to learn just how much it is possible for bias to affect research. And, social scientists have been saying this for a long time, that, science is a human endeavor, and humans studying humans, of course, our prejudices and our biases are going to come into play, especially if we're not aware of them. If we think we're being objective without really taking into account our inbuilt cultural prejudices, which we all have, including myself, we all have prejudices, then it's very easy for the research to become tainted, to the point where, like you said, even Darwin believed, up until he died, that women were intellectually inferior to men. Now the question is, why do they say these things? Now for Darwin, he looked at the world around him, and this was Victorian British society, and he thought, well, women aren't achieving very much, so this must reflect a biological fact. Perhaps women aren't as capable as men. We don't have the same mental equipment. Without really understanding that women didn't have the right to vote. They didn't have access to higher education. They often didn't have the same primary education as boys. They certainly didn't have access to the professions. If you wanted to be a female scientist, one of your few avenues was to marry another scientist or to work for your father, who might be a scientist. And very often, even the work that was done, you would never be given credit for it. This was routine. In fact, it's been fairly routine even well into the 20th century. Jocelyn Bell Burnell, who I had the pleasure of meeting last year, she did incredible work in astrophysics. Her supervisor, male supervisor, took all the credit and won the Nobel Prize, and that was in the 1970s. So, this is a problem that has gone right the way through the generations, and it still happens today. There are still scientists, sometimes in their laziness and in their failure to be introspective, who look at the world around them and assume that the differences that they see somehow reflect a biological fact, without taking into account the thousands of years of repression of women that have created the society that we see.
Right. I want to ask my audience a question, a quick poll. How many of you here believe that women and men have different brains? I'm not talking about superior brains or inferior brains. I'm saying, how many of you believe that we have different brains? Okay. So, okay, how would you address this? I'm going to now come back. Angela, give me a yes or no. Are our brains different?
Every single one of us has a different brain. There is individual difference between every single one of us. So if I were to, say, split this audience down the middle, test this lot, there may be differences between you because we are all so individually different. And this is what biology is finding, that actually looking for group differences isn't very helpful because the individual differences are so pronounced. And it's individual difference now that is becoming the focus of science in this area, because what we're realizing is just how different we are. We are not just the product of gender and society. We're the product of many different things as we grow up. A developing child's brain is influenced by so many factors, even after genetics. So, there is really no meaningful way to look for differences between groups when individually we are so varied.
So you're saying that your brain and my brain will be different because we are different individuals?
Yes, of course.
But women's brains, female brains, are not really different from male brains if we were to take them as a whole, as a group.
This is a complicated question. So in the early 20th century, there was quite a lot of research and quite a lot of claims made by male scientists, male biologists, that said women's brains are smaller, so they must be less intelligent. And yes, women's brains are on average 5 ounces smaller than the average male brain because we are shorter and smaller than the average male.
we have smaller hands.
So of course our brains are going to be smaller. That in no way reflects our cognitive ability. If it did, and this was an observation that was made by a female scientist, Helen Hamilton Gardner, who off her own steam went and studied neuroscience for herself in New York in the late 19th century. She said if brain size itself were an indicator of intelligence, then whales would surely be the most intelligent species. It's relative to body size that matters. And when you look at psychological differences, when you look at cognitive differences, they really are not there in any pronounced statistical way, or at least not to a degree which explains the profound gender difference that we see in society. And on IQ, there is no difference in average IQ between men and women, and we've known that for 100 years.
Okay, so how many of you are convinced with Angela's answer? How many of you still believe that men and women have different brains as genders?
We've made
Okay, so we made great progress. Thank you, Angela. Kiran, I'm going to ask you to jump in at this point. You know, this question of nature versus nurture. And Angela talks about this in great detail in her book. I don't know if you've had a chance to read it yet. That the reason why women perform very differently in science is because we bring up daughters very differently from our sons. Would you like to comment on this?
No, absolutely. I think, that's a known fact. I think women who get, support from wherever...
Can you all hear at the back? I want you to shout out if you can't hear, because it's important that you listen. Can you hear? No.
Can you hear?
At the back.
Can you hear now? Yeah, okay. So
there are some seats here if you want to grab these.
I think this is a very important question.
Sorry.
And again, I go back to what Angela said, that it's really about how you are raised. What were the influences in your life? In my case, my father was a big influence in my life. And he pushed me to do things which were unconventional. You know, I went off to study brewing, which was definitely unconventional. And when I actually asked my father, do you think it's the right thing to do for a woman in this country? He said, look, you've always defied the odds. Go and defy the status quo and do something unconventional. So I think you need that kind of societal support, nurturing, whatever support, whatever you call it. Because I think it is a myth that, the roles for women are X, Y, and Z, and men have to do the following. And I also want to get back to one more point, and that is that I think when you look at women in science, the entry point of women in science, where there is a level playing field, so to speak, because you have this open exam, you see a huge influx of women in STEM. Today's statistics shows that 46% of women enter the STEM ecosystem in India at the entry level. But then as you move up the hierarchy, and as the number of seats become less and it becomes a part of a review process, and I'm sorry, but most of the reviewers are male, I think you end up getting fewer and fewer women making it to the top. And that, I think, is the real problem of science and women in science in India for sure, because especially when you get to a professor's level, I think, and this is great to have Lisa here, but this is where you find that there is a very, very small representation of women at the very senior levels. And I think something has to happen, and we must take corrective action to take that gender bias out of the equation. It's almost gender exclusion. I mean, we have many, many examples in history that shows you that even someone like Marie Curie, who won not one but 2 Nobel Prizes in 2 different fields of science, and she's one of the unique Nobel laureates to have done that, was almost denied her first Nobel Prize because it was given to 2 men, including her husband, and it was one of the members of the nomination committee who saw that there was something wrong, brought it to the attention of the Nobel committee, And the husband, in fact, said that it would be a travesty if she was not included in the Nobel Prize and she was given that prize. So you can see how women have been systematically eliminated, including Rosalind Franklin, who deserved very much the Nobel Prize for the DNA, but all we know about DNA today is Watson and Crick, and at best Maurice Wilkins. But she was the one who actually discovered the DNA structure. So you can see that there has been a deliberate, sort of marginalizing of women scientists throughout history, and we must change that course of history.
Does it continue? Do you find that this deliberate marginalization
I think it continues as long as I said, you have men reviewing these kind of entry points. And I just want to say that things are changing. I'm very happy I'm on the board of Infosys, and the Infosys Science Prize have started seeing more and more women scientists being recognized. And this year, 2017, the prizes, it was a 50-50. Out of the 6, 3 were women. And it was excellent.
Great, great. Professor Randall, how do we change this idea that women cannot do science? Do we need more role models? I mean, institutionally, how do we change this?
So before I answer that question, I actually am just going to follow up on a couple of points that were made. So when I was an undergraduate at Harvard as well. And when I was there, I would go to the science library. And people were encouraging, but there was one librarian when I walked in who said, "Oh, you have to look at this study that was just done." So, about women doing science. And it really was quite amazing because I thought I should look at this. I thought let's look at it. And it was really interesting because the conclusion of this particular paper, they had studied women's scores versus men's scores, and they noticed that women did consistently worse. So their conclusion was that women were worse. However, over the 10 or 20 year period when they had done this study, the gap had closed significantly. So whereas in the beginning there was a significant difference between the male and female scores, at the end, it's true, the men were still doing better, but over the course of the 10 or 20 years where things were changing quite a lot, if you think about it in society and education, the gap had closed enormously. The really amazing thing about not only the paper itself, but all the articles that reported on this, none of them mentioned that. They all mentioned the conclusion that researchers had come to, which was simply that women had done consistently worse. And I just mention this because it's a very simple and straightforward example where if you come at the story with some idea that you want to prove in mind, you will find data to prove it. But it was such an obvious gap in noticing this really obvious trend, which was that education and opportunities were changing things. And that's the only thing that you could rigorously show from this study, because there's no other way you could control for all the other facts. My research now is on something called dark matter. I also work on something called dark energy, but mostly dark matter. Invisible matter in the universe, not made up of atoms. The reason I mention this is because I'm telling you who I am, but also because I'm going to follow up on the point that was just made, which was just that within the last year, Vera Rubin, who was really one of the chief astronomers who discovered dark matter, and dark matter is 25% of the matter in the universe. There's 5 times as much energy in the universe carried by dark matter as ordinary matter. It's a major discovery. She was not given the Nobel Prize for the discovery of dark matter. Yet the people who discovered dark energy were given the Nobel Prize. And every excuse you can go through, you can find an example of a Nobel Prize that was given. I actually wrote an op-ed about this, about her, but I did mention this. It really is shocking. And when I wrote my first book, War Passages, which was about particle physics, it really was quite remarkable because basically every man who had made an important discovery had received a Nobel Prize. But the 1 or 2 women who had, somehow there was some excuse given. So again, like the discovery of parity violation was not given a Nobel Prize, but the discovery of charge parity violation, which is a higher order step, was. So, you can look at any individual case, but it is hard to ignore this sort of systematic exclusion. So I'm going to really follow that up. In terms of how do we change this, all you women here should go into science. I mean, it's obvious. I mean, the fact is, I can talk about it we can talk about role models, but the fact is, you have to want to do science. You have to see the value in it. You have to see that that's where your real opportunities will be in many cases. I know in India it's also in medicine and engineering, and that might be the case as well. But I do think that, you know, big ideas are really fun to work on. They're really fun to study. And basically, you know, it's funny, it's interesting you mentioned Darwood, because I was actually at another discussion over lunch where one of the women who worked at Google, actually Microsoft, I apologize, she was very insistent because she was like, well, you know, the women who end up in science, they get there by natural selection. What she was saying is that, you know, you have to put up with some stuff sometimes. And at some level, that's true for everyone in science, but maybe occasionally the women have a little bit more to deal with. But really the thing is to focus on the science. And that's actually what I tried to do in the books I wrote, to say, you know, all the other stuff is incidental. You really have to have your eye on the prize.
Thank you. Angela, your book is actually filled with anecdotes and these absolutely heartbreaking stories and instances of what Kiran and Professor Randall sort of reinforce as the exclusion of women, the deliberate exclusion of women who've really achieved remarkable things. Would you like to add to that?
Well, I'm reading another interesting book at the moment called A Lab of One's Own. I'm reviewing it, so it hasn't come out yet. And it's looking at women scientists in the First World War, so in the period leading up to women getting the vote. So some women got the vote for the first time in the UK in 1918. This is the 100th anniversary. And again, the same story. Women fighting really hard to be given a seat at the table, wanting to be scientists so badly, and yet having to fight to get into university, having to fight to get a place in a lab, having to fight to get paid the same. In the First World War, often they weren't paid at all. You know, the men were paid, the women weren't paid. And if they were paid, they were routinely paid less. Not being given credit. Their names not appearing on papers because it was seen that a woman's name on the paper would somehow undermine the research, that it would be seen as less credible because a woman's name was on it. So it's a story that, you know, it's an old story. It's been there for ages. But really, think about what it means. If science was sexist enough to do this to women, scientists, within their own field, then is it not possible that that same sexism affected research on women, or what they told us about sex difference? And I think this is what the interesting thing is. Did you know when women were fighting for the vote, there was the world's leading reproductive biologist at the time, Walter Heap, wrote an entire book arguing that women shouldn't go out and campaign for the vote because they were wasting their reproductive energy, that they would be better off staying at home, taking care of their children and having babies, because that's where they were the most useful. You know, there was this idea that even the effort of intellectual kind of activity in a university would be somehow detrimental to a woman's reproductive ability. So, you know,
which is, of course, still our primary job, right? To produce children.
It's still, yeah, and we still see that. I mean, it's astounding how many people I still meet who still think that men and women occupy different spheres and that somehow this is a natural thing, when in fact, if you look at the research, and especially if you look at hunter-gatherer communities, so these are people who, as far as, you know, we can tell, they're not a great window on the past, but they are some kind of window. They live the way we would have lived more than 10,000 years ago before we settled down and had cities. And these societies are very egalitarian, generally. There is not much division of labor. In fact, I have a beautiful photograph that I talk about in the book of a woman who belonging to the Kung hunter-gatherer tribe in the Kalahari. And if you see her, she's striding through the desert. She looks like an Amazon. She is strong as anything. She's carrying, on her back, she's got a sling with the food that she's killed and gathered during the day. And we have to remember, in most hunter-gatherer tribes, women bring in more calories than men. So this idea that men bring home the bacon, women bring home more reliable calories than men. So she's carrying her food on her back. She's got her 3-year-old sitting on her shoulders. She's holding a digging stick. It looks like a spear. And she's pregnant. And this is how most women live through history. You know, this is still the reality of most women alive today. If you go into rural India, and I've covered a lot of stories in farms in Africa and in India, you see women doing hard physical labor, running farms single-handedly. So this idea that women are somehow, the weaker sex, intellectually or physically, is just not true. It's not borne out by historical evidence, and it's not borne out actually by the evidence of the real world if you just step outside.
Sure. That, of course, is the history. Kiran, would you like to comment on the ongoing story? I'm talking about the current story, on the difficulty, and I think I'm speaking for a lot of women. It's not just in science, but this business of getting a seat on the table. And if I can just make a small little digression, I read a story in the Washington Post about the Obama administration, which was actually a great administration for women because he had a lot of women in the White House in really powerful positions. And yet the women found that in meetings, what would happen is when they made a point, it was either not heard, and then a man would 5 minutes later repeat or reiterate the same point, and everybody would say, wow, that is genius. Why did, and so the women then made a decision. They said, because, this happens all the time, men talking over us and then stealing our points. And so the women banded up. So if there were 4 of us on a table and Angela made a point and then a man kind of spoke over her, I would say, well, no, listen, I think Angela said a great thing, and let's come back to it. And the women in the Obama administration did that as a coping mechanism. Does that happen in business? I mean, in the business, not just in science, but in your field?
So let me go back to what you just talked about, nurture and nature, right? I just want to give you one outstanding example in corporate India, where one man actually nurtured women leaders in his organization, and today 4 of the 6 biggest banks are headed by these women. And this is Mr. Vagul of ICICI Bank. So I think it tells you that you empower women, you enable women, and they become great leaders. I mean, today Chanda Kochar, Shikha Sharma, and Kalpana Morparia and Lalita Gupte, they all come from that stock. So I can just tell you that, and there were many more. So you can see that women have played very strong leadership roles, and a lot of people get quite amazed to see that the banking sector in India is actually headed by women. So I think that's quite a telling story about this whole prejudice and bias that we have about women not being able to play leadership roles. Now, in my own case, of course, I started a sector called biotechnology, which nobody understood when I started. And apart from there being a gender bias as far as I was concerned, because I couldn't access capital very easily. I was considered high risk in every way possible because I was trying to start an unusual business. I was young, I was a woman, which was the biggest risk they felt. The fact is that after I succeeded, it was interesting to see how many women actually ventured into the field of biotech. And today I'm really excited because there's a startup boom now in the life sciences. And 30% of the founders and co-founders are women. So it tells you that, today women are understanding the importance of pursuing scientific careers. So
we've had a distraction.
So I just think that there is a bias, but at the same time, I think we have to make sure that change happens sooner than later, and I think women have to push the agenda much stronger than anyone else.
Right. I know Angela has a monkey story coming up by popular demand. Angela, and then I'll come back to you, Professor.
Well, it's not a monkey story, it's a primate story. It's actually about apes, and apes we know are different from monkeys. But one of the examples I give in my book, so one of the issues I explore is this issue of male domination. Is male domination somehow hardwired into the human species? Some people believe it is, that this is kind of the natural setup. Men are naturally more powerful than women. And sometimes the argument is given that it's because they're physically stronger. Various arguments are given. Now, throughout the 20th century, one of the models for the evolutionary history of humans was chimpanzees, because chimpanzees are one of the two closest species to us genetically. And chimpanzees are male-dominated. They form very strong hierarchies amongst the males. The males are very violent towards males lower down in the hierarchy, but also towards females that they want to mate with. So to all intents and purposes, that sounds like a lot of human societies. And so chimps became the model. What people didn't look at was the other species, other primate species that is equally close to us, and that's the bonobo ape. The bonobo is sometimes called the pygmy chimpanzee. And primate researchers pretty much ignored this because they assumed bonobos would behave exactly the way chimps behave. They just look a bit smaller. But actually, when they studied them, they turned out to be completely different. Now, I went to San Diego Zoo to look at bonobos in captivity. The first thing I saw when I arrived was a male bonobo whose finger had been very badly injured, almost cut off, by a female, an older female. And apparently this is very common amongst bonobos in wild and in captivity for females to attack males. And the reason is bonobos are female-dominated. Now the question is why? Why two species so alike and so close to us genetically? Why is one male-dominated and one female-dominated? It's not to do with size. In both species, the male is slightly larger than the female. The difference amongst bonobos is that the females, even if they're unrelated, form very strong bonds with each other. And these bonds are so tight, they have gained control, they have gained domination of the group, despite their size. Now, I'm not drawing comparisons between them and us, but I think there's a lesson here maybe, or we can take it as a metaphor for how important strength in numbers really is. As women, when we come together, we can really achieve things. This is what men have done over centuries. They have formed clubs, they have formed groups, institutions in which women were excluded. We can form our own powerful institutions and our own clubs. We can enter those institutions and gain power if we work together.
Sure. Professor Randall, do women need to network more in science?
Well, first, we need enough women that we can network. That's the first step. I think that, science is interesting. There's many different types of science. Science is in many ways an individual pursuit in terms of your ideas, but of course your research group matters. And I think a lot of this recognition stuff we've been talking about, certainly networking matters. I'm a terrible networker, so I'm not really one to speak to this. I kind of go off and do my own thing with people that want to do interesting research. So I think, we always want one simple answer. I mean, I think networking helps many people. It also helps to go off and think independently. I mean, one thing that, and maybe this is just, making lemonade, but I actually do think one difference, if I was going to really cite a difference between the way men and women are viewed, is because it's really just that women are, in all fields, are given a little bit less of the benefit of the doubt. They can prove themselves, and many people, once they prove themselves, will see that. But I think you do have to prove yourself. And in many ways, of course, it's unfair. In many ways, people might disagree with me and say this is just an observation, which it is. But I think the good thing about it is that it raises women to high standards. And I think having high standards eventually helps you do good things. And I think we've seen that with many different people. So I don't think it's one simple answer. And I think certain types of research, especially if you have big labs, networking matters. For theoretical research, it's important that you have like-minded people that you can talk to. But it's not as simple as saying women will band together, although that can help as well. I will say, though, that in the research we're doing now, and I'm doing with mostly male postdocs, but we actually are looking at the what's called the Hulse-Taylor pulsar, and I said we're going to rename it. We're going to call it the Bell pulsar. And they seem to be happy to do that. And I think, it's our small way of sort of giving recognition where it's due.
Right. And I can only imagine the double burden of A, proving you're better than and anybody else, and being held up to that high standard. But that's fine, because as you said, that makes you better at your work. But then after having been held up to that high standard, then being held up as an example of a scientist who made it despite being a woman, or an entrepreneur who made it despite being a woman, or a writer who could do it despite having a 4-year-old son. And my God, you sometimes just want to be known as a scientist, entrepreneur, writer, or whatever without your gender, but there's no escaping that, is there?
That's right, and I have to say, it's frustrating, because I write books where I very deliberately avoid the issue of gender, because I think the more powerful message really is that the science and that it's incidental. That's kind of the message I want to send. And it's not that I'm not thinking about influencing women, but I don't think it helps to keep pointing it out. Yeah. I think it's more important that people say, oh, I remember when I was an undergraduate, we learned about a theorem, and then to find out it was Emma Noether, that it was this woman who had done the theorem. And we learned the theorem first, and of course it was exciting to see that, but it wasn't the first thing that we were told. It was just told as part of the science. So I think that, on the one hand, of course we all care about this issue, and we want to see things change. On the other hand, sometimes by pointing it out, you're actually lessening the achievement. That's not always true, but sometimes it's true, because you're not focusing on the actual fact that there's an achievement. And it also, and this is another problem, I think, it lumps everyone together. With guys, you have individuals who do specific areas, who do specific achievements. With women, you have the woman who does biotechnology. I mean, every woman doing biotechnology is doing something different. And so let's point out their major achievements. So I think when we get to the point where it's more incidental, then we'll know we've really arrived.
Right. How do you deal with the double burden?
No, I just think that, I agree with what Lisa said, but I think it's very interesting. During my journey, I found that there is a credibility curve that women have to cross. And that credibility curve, it's very interesting, has to do with perceptions. You've got to break those perceptions. So every time you break that perception, you actually get closer to crossing that credibility curve. And once you cross that credibility curve, then you find that, this so-called gender issues somehow disappear. I don't think today I'm considered a woman business leader anymore, because I'm heading the largest biopharmaceutical company. Yes, I am a woman. And I am, of course, I know a lot of young women get inspired by my story. But, when I'm in corporate circles, I don't think they look at me as a woman business leader anymore. And I think, you will see that this is happening in corporate India, where, as I mentioned to you, we have many women business leaders. So I think we're breaking that myth about, the differences between men and women. And I think it is strength in numbers. The more women that come into these fields, I think you'll get that equality, that sort of neutrality when it comes to gender bias. So, I think this is what is required. And I can at least see that improving in many spheres, but it has to happen at a much faster pace.
I'm going to ask you, because at the second question, Kiran, because you are familiar with the Indian landscape. So I just want to ask you, there was a move where SEBI, I think, said that you've got to have a quota of women on company boards. And then you know what happened, because overnight everybody put their mothers and their wives on company boards. Do you think that there should be? There's a lot of talk, for instance, that IIT should be earmarking and will be earmarking additional seats for women. Is it productive, counterproductive? How do you look at it?
I think companies have to discover and recognize the importance of diversity on boards. And of course, gender is a very important part of that diversity. And I think, of course, I don't want to rattle off statistics that clearly show you that, boards with good gender balance actually are better performing boards. But I think it's very important for companies to recognize this, because I clearly see, many boards that I function on where we have women. I think we're a much more effective board. And I'll speak about the IIM board, in Bangalore, which I chaired for a few years. And we had one of the largest representation of women board of governors members. Members on the board of governors. And I can tell you, we were a very, very effective board. And I was on that board for many years when I was the only woman. And I remember once we got a few more women on board, and we had some excellent women, directors, I think we made an outstanding, contribution to IIM Bangalore.
Yeah, but should there be reservation for women in science, in IITs, in medical colleges?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think there has to be better representation. As I said, I think if you change the composition of the boards and the people who take decisions, the decision makers, the influencers, and the reviewers, you get more women in those positions, you will see a huge change in the number of women entering science and technology.
Mm-hmm. We were talking, Kiran and I, when we were walking over here a few minutes ago, just before we got onto here, talking about the difference between sexual harassment at the workplace and gender harassment at the workplace. Would any of you like to weigh in on that? Kiran, you go first.
No, I think there is some truth in that. I think when you talk about gender harassment, it's really about excluding women from their rightful opportunities. Okay, sexual harassment is a very different connotation. So I really think it's about focusing on making sure that women get equal opportunities. The moment you don't give them equal opportunities, it is gender harassment.
Absolutely.
Well, I was going to say on this IIT issue, I've always been slightly uncomfortable with quotas and reservations because they're a very blunt instrument for creating equality. They come right at the end of the process rather than at the beginning. And if experience and history can tell us anything, it's that from the very birth of a child, that's when the differences start to become instilled in their minds, when the stereotypes begin. From the second we give a girl pink and we give a boy blue, when we give him cars and trucks and we give her a doll, we're already creating change within that child. And that continues all the way through the process. Now, I think you said earlier that, something like 40%, more than 40% of engineering colleges, the intake is girls. In the IITs, it's very much smaller. And the IITs,
single, about 9 to 10.
Now, of course, I studied engineering. When I was at Oxford, I was the only girl in my engineering class. When I was at school, I was the only girl in my chemistry and physics classes. So when I went to IIT Delhi to visit as a journalist, I wasn't surprised at all. I was one of the only girls in the lecture theatres. But we have to remember, what is the process when it comes to these elite institutions? What is the process it takes to get a child a place there? And it is not just raw talent. This idea that raw talent is somehow the reason that this cadre of people have reached this position is just crazy. They are coached to within an inch of their lives. They spend every single minute at coaching stations, even the very best of them. Their parents have invested huge amounts of resources, which is also the reason you tend to get very high caste in the IITs. It's because these are the parents that have the resources to pump into their children. And the same comes with gender. We expect more from our boys than we do for our girls. We push our boys in ways we don't push our girls. When we want them to reach the very, very best, we think, okay, the boy can do it, we'll do it for him. It's more important for him that he achieves this kind of massive goal, and we don't put the same effort into the girls. The girls want to do it. We know they do, because in all the other engineering colleges, they are there. In the IITs, the system is so skewed by coaching, by pushing, by all these other pressures.
And don't forget, the fact is that who does public space belong to? So when you do not have safe public transportation, how is your daughter going to go to the coaching class late in the evening? How is she going to come back? I mean, these are real considerations. I know Professor Randall wants to come in.
So, first of all, I totally support that point. I'm actually going to take a risk now because I've actually just met these two women this week. Do either of you have an older brother?
No, yes.
Yeah. Older, yeah. So in my experience, and this is again very informal, that most of the women who are really successful in these fields don't have older brothers for precisely this reason, that you were the boy, in the family, that there wasn't this other person. So I don't know that it's true, but this was just an experiment. I've never met them. The odds were against me, just to point that out. And it turned out to be true.
And actually, I was just going to say, like Kiran, I don't know if it was the same for you, but my father was an engineer, and he really was the driving force for me to enter the science.
So that's not true for me, but I was very aware that if had there been a boy in the family, it very likely would have been a different situation. And I come from a family with 3 girls, for what it's worth. So I'm keenly aware of that, and so I definitely think that's true. That it's what we expect, and I think basically when people ask like, what made you do this? It's sort of more like, what made me not follow the other path? Like I wasn't properly socialized. I wasn't taught I'm not supposed to do that, and I think that's often the key. And so one of the things I want to point out, and it kind of touches on the quota issue, is that to the extent that we can make things fair and balanced, we often don't need those things, but we just really have to be sure we're doing that. It's true that we're not going to have the same pipeline if we don't encourage women, but it's often true also that women and men are judged differently. And to the extent that we can make these judgments sort of neutral, we're going to be better off. So I'd like to say, I'd like to believe that we will get to that point, so quotas aren't necessary, but sometimes I'm not on the fence on that issue. But I do think that when we make quotas, we should realize that what it's fighting against. It's fighting against the natural tendencies to make unfair decisions. If it was starting from a fair point, it would be a very different situation.
Right. I think Kiran will back me up when I say that there are too many instances when women go for interviews, merit-based interviews for jobs, and they are told, why do you want to do this? This job belongs to a man. You're going to get married. You're going to have kids. Why are you taking up a man's job? Is that right? I'm going to open this up very quickly because I can see that there's a hand up now. This is the way we're going to do it. I'm going to request you to ask very pointed questions in the interest of fairness so we can get more questions in. I want the mics out. We'll take 3 questions at a time. Please, let's get a mic here to the lady in there. There was a hand that went up here. I want a mic there. And I want a mic way at the back. Just check that your mics are working because you don't want to grab a mic and see that it's not working. Go.
This is for Angela. Could you give us an instance of bad scientific research that's, gender-based?
3 at a time. What's our next question was here? You got a mic? You got a mic? No. So give him a mic. Who's got a mic?
Yeah.
Go.
My question is the standard argument against the different statistics that there are not many women in science or in high-paying jobs or strong professions is that they make different choices. And because of these choices that there are not many women in these positions. How would you counter that point? What would you say?
Who's that question for?
Any of them.
Anyone. Okay. Do we have a mic here? Yeah. You got a mic? Go.
My question is to Angela.
I can't hear.
My question is to Angela. Right now you mentioned that it's not about reservations. I think it's about the way we upbring the girl child or the boy child.
Yeah, we
so
said
I
that.
think can we it's better to create a level playing ground for both of them from the starting onwards so that the merit wins rather than gender.
We got that. Angela?
Yes, like I said before, in an ideal world, we would have a level playing field. Every child would have the same equal opportunities, equal chance to fulfill their potential. They don't have that. So the question is, how do you achieve that quickly? How do you, like I said, it's a blunt instrument, but in some cases you need it because you don't have that change. It takes a generation or more to achieve that change. Now, in response to the scientific studies, now this is how I structured the book. I pick apart certain very high-profile scientific studies and look at the way that bias has affected the research. And I'll give you a very quick example. So some years ago, not very long ago, a study was done at Cambridge University into newborn babies. Is there a sex difference in the behavior of newborn babies? This was hoped to answer the decades-old or the centuries-old nurture versus nature question. Because if you can see a sex difference in newborn babies, which nobody ever has, nobody's ever seen a sex difference of any kind until the age of 2. And of course, there's a lot of socialization up to that point. So they showed newborn babies in a maternity hospital a picture of a mobile and a picture of a mobile and a picture of a face. And they reasoned that if a baby looks at the mobile, then they're more inclined to be kind of systematic thinkers, kind of thinking, doing male brain types. If they look at the face, then they're more likely to be empathetic, kind of intuitive female brain types.
That was a science.
This was a study that was done. Now, the researcher found a difference between these newborn babies, and it was a very big study. It has been cited thousands of times. It has been used by people to defend the idea that sex differences are innate between men and women. Now, I spoke to the woman who did this study. She was a young PhD student working in the lab of the man whose idea this was. And when she did the study, she told me it was a bit like a science fair experiment. She went in, she knew the sexes of the babies. Now, anyone who works in science knows that already prejudices the experiment. One reason why it has never been replicated. She knew the sex of the baby, of course, because it's a maternity hospital. There are pink balloons, the names of the babies are there. And yet, this wasn't explained in the paper. Nobody mentioned this. When she went to defend her dissertation, she failed. So they got a new set of reviewers to pass it. And then it was published without any of this being explained in the background. So we have to remember there is always a context here to these experiments and why they're done. This experiment was done because the chief researcher, the supervisor in charge, has a very prominent theory that he's written about in the popular press, that there is such a thing as separate male-female brains, and he wanted to use this study to defend that, and he did.
Amazing. There was also a question on choice. Professor Randall, Kiran, would you like to take that? There was a question at the back. Remember, on choice? How do we choose? Would you like to repeat that question?
I'll just say, so the question, I believe, was, whether women are choosing not to do science or whether they're choosing to do other things. Clearly, at some level, they're choosing. The question is, what are the circumstances under which they're doing that? And I think that's the issue we're addressing. Are they being given the same opportunities so that it's as rewarding to do it?
I believe we've got the mics out already.
Hello. This question is for Professor Randall. So good to hear you out. Apart from the topic, I just want to ask about your book, Dark Matter and Dinosaurs, and what your inspiration was to get into dark matter and antimatter, and give just a brief point of view about your
Great.
study.
What's the next question? Can we just take two? So we'll just take a couple. So, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my question is for Angela Saini. So in India, basically, we see this, and right outside the JLF, I saw it, because it was really easy for me to get inside, because I saw a really long queue of men.
Right.
So this question is that, do you think that the demography have a fair share in this exclusion and bias and discrimination? Because women are certainly very less than men.
No, we're 48.5% of the population.
But
I didn't
did
get
you
your
see?
question.
Did you see the queue outside? There was a huge queue of men, and there were very less women who were going inside.
More men
coming
coming
inside. It was very easy for me to get inside. I just walked in.
I'm not sure what this has to do with the session, but I'm sure Angela will take it. We have a third. Where's the third mic? Yeah, it's right up there. Can you?
Yeah. Hi, my question is for Ms. Shaw. So in the morning at Surjit Bhada's session, you had spoken out against the reservation system, saying that a proper implementation of, say, in India, the RTE would help with that. Why over here have you chosen to speak for reservation in the context of women in science?
We got that.
I didn't speak, I didn't say, I wasn't against it. I mean, I didn't speak contrarian. I said that we need to create equal opportunities for women and give them a fairer chance to really get represented in the mainstream. And I was consistent in the morning, and I'm consistent now.
I hope that answers. Professor, would you like to take the one on dark matter and dinosaurs?
Okay, it's a big topic. I actually did an entire session on it. So let me just tell you very briefly. What I do is model building. We're trying to figure out what stuff is. There's a lot of evidence that dark matter is out there based on its gravitational influence. I don't have time to go into that now. But we're trying to figure out what it is. Is it an elementary particle? What kind of particle is it? Does it interact with matter a little bit? Does it interact with itself a little bit? Is it one particle? Is it many particles? The way we're going to go about answering that is by considering possibilities. So we consider a possibility where there's two types of dark matter at least, one of which is charged under its own force, so it has its own light that our matter doesn't see. The reason this is critical is because the reason in the Milky Way we have the Milky Way disk and dark matter halo. The reason we have the Milky Way disk is because ordinary matter radiates and can cool down and collapse. So if dark matter is charged, it has the possibility of doing the same thing, in which case there can be a dense dark matter disk in the Milky Way, which would change the motion of stars, and it's something we can actually measure. The reason it could conceivably be relevant to the dinosaurs, and this is very vast speculation, is what isn't speculation is that the last extinction 66 million years ago was caused by a big rock 10 to 15 kilometers in size hitting the Earth. What we propose is that as the solar system goes around the Milky Way, we know it bobs up and down every so many tens of millions of years. How quickly it does that depends on how much matter is there. If there's a dense disk of dark matter, this could happen about every 30 million years. And at those times, you would have extra gravitational force on the solar system that could conceivably knock comets out of the Oort cloud, which means that at those times, you're more likely to get hit by a rock. Now, this thing happened 66 million years ago, so it happened, and we went through around 2 million years ago. So this is actually in agreement with the timing. And there's marginal evidence that big things, big impacts have happened on a periodic basis of around 30 million years.
Right. And of course, the longer answer is read the book. I'm going to answer that question about the demographic. I'm not sure we have a gender breakup because to my eye, it seems that we're pretty evenly gender represented. But if the lines were longer, I shall indeed check with the organizers. And it might have something to do with how women feel in crowded public spaces. I'm guessing, and I don't have a definitive answer, I'm speculating. Maybe we don't feel that safe in a crowded public space where a man would feel. And if you're looking for lines, I can promise you the line outside the ladies' loo is twice as long as the line outside the men's loo. Do we have time to take one more question? Do we? We can take one more question right in front. Right in front, I'm going to give it to a woman. I'm sorry, gender bias. Yeah.
I feel that behind the success of a woman, there are many men in form of various relations, in form of a husband, in form of a father, in form of a brother, and the women, in fact, because I've been in corporate, they're pulling other women down.
Oh, Kiran, would you like to take that?
No, I don't want to even get into that kind of a discussion and debate. I really believe that every woman has to have confidence and should feel secure enough to go ahead and really not get into this kind of debate.
Sorry,
Okay, Angela's dying to rebut. That was the last question, but I'm just going to...
I'll just very quickly say that you're right that in as much as... I don't think women... I'm sure every experience is different, and I don't want to deny your experience, but it's true that actually family does matter in the success of women. So when we look at female CEOs, I don't know if this is your experience, Kiran, but female CEOs often have a very supportive partner at home because the homework still has to get done, And that's one thing we forget when we want sexual equality. The work at home still has to get done, and very often women still take it on. We still do the cooking, we still do the cleaning, and we do our full-time job, and we're expected to put in all the hours. There was one panel discussion I had with top female scientists, and they were asked, what advice would you give to women who want to enter the field? And one of their advice was, marry wisely. Marry a man who's going to support you. Don't marry a man who's going to drag you down or, not support you.
There is that statistic which shows that in the tech sector, when at entry level, women actually have an edge. It's 51% women entering, and then you have what they call the leaky pipeline. So by mid-career, because the women are the ones who are looking after the board exams and the children and the parents, hers as well as his, and the cooking, cleaning, etc. And so the unpaid care work, falls disproportionately on her. So I would not agree that women and, feminism is not a biological function. It's not that we're all naturally born feminists because we're women. We are victims of patriarchy, whether we're men or women. Right.
I'm going to say we are all born feminists because I think we're all born thinking that everyone's pretty much valuable and the same, and we learn other things as we get older.
Okay, last word to Professor Randall. I have good news for you. I think my panel is going to be around. They're going to be signing books. Is that right? Yeah? Yeah? Is there a book signing? So please do, if you have a copy of the book, please do go up to them, ask them to sign. They may perhaps be nice enough to answer any lingering questions. I'm sure there are many. You've been great. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to all our volunteers. Oh, you guys are great. Thank you to my panel. Have a good evening.